Hi guys. Tonight we begin by stepping into the crisp, biting air of a California mountain camp in 1849. The sun has just dipped below the jagged peaks and already the temperature is plummeting. You can hear the distant rush of the creek where you spent all day bent over a pan, your back screaming, your hands raw and bleeding from the icy water. But now, as darkness settles over the canyon, a different kind of struggle begins. The struggle to simply survive the night. The reality is simple. Gold Rush miners didn't sleep in cozy cabins with fireplaces and feather beds. They slept in crude tents, under tarps, sometimes just wrapped in blankets under the open sky. And when winter arrived in these mountain camps, perched at elevations where snow could fall in September and last until May, the cold became as dangerous as any claim jumper or grizzly bear. You probably won't sleep well tonight, at least by modern standards. But if you're lucky, you'll wake up in the morning. So, before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world people are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Let your breathing slow, and imagine yourself preparing for bed in a mining camp high in the Sierra Nevada. The adventure has brought you here, but survival will keep you alive through the night. The journey to the camps, 2 to 6 o'clock. You picture yourself now, months earlier, standing at the docks in San Francisco. The fever has gripped you like thousands of others. Gold. The very words seem to shimmer with promise. Men abandoned farms, shops, families, everything to chase the dream of striking it rich in the mountain streams of California. You were one of them, swept up in the mania, convinced that fortune waited just over the horizon. The journey inland was brutal. You walked, rode mules, or, if you were lucky, caught a ride on a supply wagon heading toward the foothills. The landscape changed with each mile. The coastal valleys gave way to rolling hills, then steeper terrain, until finally you were climbing into the high country. Pine forests thick with shadow, granite cliffs that seemed to scrape the sky, and everywhere the sound of water, rushing, tumbling, carrying with it the glitter of possibility.
But here's what the newspapers back east never told you. The camps you arrived at weren't towns. They were barely even settlements. A few dozen tents scattered along a creek bed. Maybe a rough saloon made of canvas and scrap wood. A general store where everything cost 10 times what it should. No churches, no schools, no law beyond what men enforced with fists or pistols, and certainly no comfortable places to sleep. Historians often describe the gold rush as one of the largest mass migrations in American history. Over 300,000 people flooded into California between 1848 and 1855. They came from every corner of the world. Americans, yes, but also Chileans, Chinese, Irish, French, Australians. The camps were a chaotic mix of languages, customs, and desperation. Everyone had come for the same reason, and everyone quickly learned the same harsh truth. Most would find nothing. A quirky detail from miners' journals. Many men wrote about the shock of their first night in camp. After weeks of travel, fueled by fantasies of wealth, they finally arrived, only to realize they had no shelter, no bedding, and no idea how to survive a mountain winter. One 49er from Maine described lying awake all night, shivering so violently he thought his bones would crack. He hadn't even started mining yet, and already he was wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. You imagine yourself on that first evening, standing at the edge of camp as twilight fades. The other miners barely glance at you. Everyone's too exhausted, too focused on their own suffering. You've carried with you what you could: a wool blanket, a tin cup, a knife, some cornmeal and salt pork. It seemed like enough when you left San Francisco. Now, looking at the thin canvas tents flapping in the wind, you realize it's nowhere near adequate. The camps were positioned wherever gold was found, and that usually meant high elevation, narrow canyons, exposed ridgelines. From a prospecting standpoint, it made sense. You wanted to be near the water, near the deposits. But from a survival standpoint, it was madness. These locations offered no natural shelter from wind. The sun disappeared early behind the peaks, leaving the valleys in shadow for hours before true nightfall. And when winter storms rolled in, they hit with a ferocity that flatlanders couldn't comprehend. One account from a French miner describes a camp at nearly 6,000 feet, where the snow fell so heavily in November that tents collapsed under the weight. Men who had been sleeping inside woke up buried, thrashing in the darkness, clawing their way out before they suffocated. After that, he wrote, everyone slept with a knife within reach, ready to slash through canvas if necessary. The cold was one enemy. Avalanches and snow were others. You sit down now on a log near the camp's central fire. A few miners huddle close, hands stretched toward the flames. Nobody speaks much. Conversation takes energy, and energy is something nobody can afford to waste. You watch the fire, mesmerized by the way the light flickers across exhausted faces. These men look older than they probably are. Dirt embedded in every crease of skin, eyes hollow from lack of sleep, beards matted and unkempt. This is what the dream looks like.
The fire is communal, fed by whoever finds wood. In the early days of a camp, timber was plentiful, but as weeks turned to months, the nearby trees were all cut down, and men had to range farther and farther to gather fuel. Some camps instituted rules. Everyone contributes, or you don't get to share the warmth. It was brutal pragmatism, but it kept people alive. As the sky darkens fully, stars begin to emerge, cold and distant. The temperature drops sharply. You feel it in your chest with every breath, the air cutting into your lungs. Around you, miners start to drift away from the fire, heading toward their tents or sleeping spots. The nightly ritual is beginning, and you realize with a sinking feeling that you're about to experience your first true night in the mountains. You walk toward the tent you've been assigned to share with 3 other miners. It's a simple A-frame design, just a piece of canvas draped over a ridgepole and staked to the ground. No floor, no door, just an opening at one end that you have to crawl through. The canvas is stained and patched in several places. It ripples and snaps in the wind like a living thing. Inside, the space is barely large enough for 4 men to lie side by side. The ground is hard-packed dirt, cold and uneven. One of your tent mates has spread a layer of pine boughs to create a slight cushion, but it's not much. The smell is immediate and overpowering. Unwashed bodies, damp wool, smoke, and the faint sour tang of beans and bacon grease. You've smelt worse, you think, but barely. Here's a fact that historians emphasize. The vast majority of gold rush miners had no experience with wilderness survival. They were farmers, clerks, shopkeepers, school teachers. They'd never built a shelter, never slept outdoors in winter, never had to forage for firewood or hunt for food. Everything they learned through trial and error often meant frostbite, hypothermia, or death.
The tents themselves were wildly inadequate. Most were made of lightweight canvas, designed for summer camping or military use in temperate climates. They provided almost no insulation. Wind cut through the weave, rain soaked through within minutes, and when snow fell, it piled on top, sometimes tearing the fabric or collapsing the whole structure. Men who could afford it bought heavier oilcloth or rubberized canvas, but even that was only marginally better. A curious note from the records: some miners tried to insulate their tents by packing dirt or snow around the base, creating a kind of berm. The idea was to block the wind from whipping underneath. It helped, slightly, but it also made the interior darker and even more claustrophobic. Others hung blankets or hides on the inside walls, creating a double layer. Again, marginally effective, but every little bit mattered. You picture yourself now, lying on your back inside the tent. Your 3 tent mates are already settling in. One is a German immigrant who speaks almost no English. Another is a young man from Ohio, maybe 19, who coughs constantly, a wet, rattling sound that keeps everyone awake. The third is a grizzled veteran of the camps, older, maybe 40, with a scar across his cheek and a permanent scowl. He's the one who explained the rules on your first day. Don't steal, don't bring trouble, and don't complain about the cold, because nobody cares. The temperature inside the tent is barely different from outside. Your breath forms clouds in the dim light of a single candle stub someone has lit. The ground radiates cold upward, seeping through your blanket and into your bones. You're still wearing all your clothes, wool trousers, a flannel shirt, a heavy coat, even your boots. Taking anything off would be suicide. The goal isn't to be comfortable. The goal is to not freeze. Historians debate whether these tents provided any real psychological benefit. Physically, they were marginal shelters at best, but psychologically, having a defined space, a home, however crude, may have helped miners maintain their sanity. The alternative, sleeping fully exposed to the elements, felt like giving up on civilization entirely. The tent was a fragile symbol of order in a chaotic, hostile environment.
One account from a miner in Nevada County describes how he personalized his tent by carving his initials into the ridgepole and hanging a small mirror on a nail. It sounds absurd, but he wrote that it made him feel human again. Having a space that was his, even if it was just a corner of a freezing canvas box, gave him a reason to keep going. Without those small rituals, he believed he would have lost his mind. You shift your position, trying to find a spot where a rock isn't digging into your ribs. The German mutters something in his sleep. The young man from Ohio coughs again, a long, painful spasm that makes you wince. The older veteran lies perfectly still, arms crossed over his chest, eyes closed. You wonder if he's actually asleep or just pretending, conserving energy. Outside, the wind picks up, howling through the canyon. The tent shudders and strains against its stakes. You hear the distant crack of a tree branch breaking under the weight of snow. Somewhere, a man shouts, probably cursing as his campfire dies or his tent collapses. The sounds of the camp at night are never peaceful, always some struggle, some small disaster unfolding. As you lie there, you begin to understand why so many miners abandoned their claims and fled back to civilization before winter even truly set in. The gold was real, yes, but the cost of pursuing it was almost unbearable. And every night, as you crawled into your freezing tent and tried to will yourself into sleep, you had to ask the same question: is this worth it? The answer, for most, was no, but for you, at least for tonight, the answer was yes, because you'd come too far to turn back now. So you pull your blanket tighter, tuck your hands under your armpits, and close your eyes. The long night has just begun. You shift again, and the rough wool of your blanket scratches against your face. If there was one universal truth among gold rush miners, it was this: your blanket was your lifeline. Men guarded their blankets more jealously than their gold. Lose your blanket, and you were as
The
good as
blankets
dead.
most miners carried were simple wool affairs, often military surplus or mass-produced trade blankets. Wool had one critical advantage: it retained warmth even when damp. And dampness was a constant problem. Sweat from the day's labor, condensation from your breath at night, mist from the creek, rain, snow, everything conspired to make your bedding wet. Cotton would have been useless. Wool, at least, gave you a fighting chance. Detailed accounts from miners' letters describe the ritual of bedtime preparation. You didn't just lie down and pull a blanket over yourself, you layered strategically. First, you spread one blanket on the ground, creating a barrier between you and the frozen earth. Then you lay down, fully clothed, and wrapped a second blanket around your body like a cocoon. If you had a third blanket, you used it to cover your head, leaving just a small opening to breathe through. But here's the problem. Most miners didn't have 3 blankets. They were lucky to have one. Blankets were expensive in the camps. A single wool blanket could cost the equivalent of several days' worth of gold, if you found any gold at all. Supply and demand were brutal. The merchants who hauled goods up into the mountains knew they had a captive audience. They charged whatever they wanted. A quirky tidbit from the historical record. Some miners, desperate for extra insulation, would line their blankets with newspaper or even dried leaves. The idea was to create air pockets that would trap heat. It's the same principle behind modern insulation, and it worked, to a degree. But paper disintegrated quickly, and leaves crumbled into dust. So every few nights you'd have to replace the stuffing, assuming you could find materials. You picture yourself now, wrapped in your single wool blanket, trying to generate enough body heat to stay alive. Your clothing is part of the strategy too. You're wearing wool trousers, heavy and itchy, a flannel shirt, torn at the elbows but still functional, a canvas coat, stiff with dirt and grease, 2 pairs of socks, both full of holes, and your boots, cracked leather monstrosities that leak when wet but are better than nothing.
Historians often point out that gold rush miners were woefully unprepared for the climate. Many arrived in summer when the days were hot and dry. They assumed California was a land of sunshine and warmth. Then October came, and with it the first snows, and suddenly men were scrambling to acquire winter clothing they couldn't afford and didn't know how to use properly. Layering was an art form. too many layers and you'd sweat during the day, soaking your clothes, which would then freeze at night. Too few layers and you'd lose body heat faster than you could generate it. The sweet spot was difficult to find, and most men never quite figured it out. They oscillated between overheating and freezing, never comfortable, always struggling. One account from a miner in Placerville describes how he slept in every piece of clothing he owned, including 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, and 4 pairs of socks. He looked ridiculous, he admitted, like a scarecrow stuffed with rags, but he survived the winter, while others round him didn't. Fashion meant nothing. Function was everything. You lie there now, feeling the layers press against your skin. The wool itches terribly, especially around your neck and wrists where it rubs. Your feet ache from the tight boots, but you're too afraid to take 'em off. If your feet freeze during the night, you might lose toes. Frostbite was common. Men woke up with blackened fingers and toes that eventually had to be amputated, often by a camp doctor, who was really just another miner with a sharp knife and a bottle of whiskey. The psychological weight of the clothing is interesting too. You're wearing your entire wardrobe at once. If something happens, if the tent catches fire, if you have to run, you can't grab your belongings and flee. You are your belongings. Everything you own is on your body. It's a strange, vulnerable feeling.
As the night deepens, you become hyper-aware of every sensation. The pressure of the blanket, the cold spot where your hip touches the ground, the faint warmth trapped against your chest, the icy air on your face. You breathe slowly, trying to conserve energy, trying to will your body to generate more heat. Historians note that many miners developed a kind of meditation practice, though they wouldn't have called it that. Lying in the freezing dark, unable to sleep, they would focus on their breathing, on counting heartbeats, on recalling warm memories from home. It was a survival mechanism. If you panicked, if you let fear take over, you'd burn through your energy reserves too quickly. Calm endurance was the only path through the night. One miner wrote in his diary about imagining himself back in his mother's kitchen, sitting by the stove, eating fresh bread with butter and honey. He described the fantasy in excruciating detail. The warmth of the fire, the smell of the bread, the taste of the honey. It didn't make him warmer, but it gave him something to hold on to, a reason to keep breathing through the cold. You try the same technique now. You think about home, about warmth, about comfort, but the images feel distant, almost unreal, as though they belong to someone else's life. The cold is too immediate, too overwhelming. It drowns out everything else. And so you stop trying to escape mentally. You accept where you are. You accept the cold. You accept that this is your reality now. And in that acceptance of peace, not comfort, but peace, the struggle doesn't end, but it becomes manageable. You breathe, you endure, you wait for morning. You remember the fire from earlier, the way it cast flickering shadows across the camp. Fire was everything in these mountain settlements. It cooked your food, dried your clothes, kept predators at bay, and, most importantly, provided the only reliable source of heat.
But fire was also a constant challenge, a hungry beast that demanded endless feeding.
In the early days of a camp, when timber was plentiful, keeping a fire going was relatively easy. Men would fell small trees, chop them into logs, and stack the wood near the central fire pit. But as weeks turned into months, the nearby forest was stripped bare. Trees within a quarter-mile of camp disappeared, then a half-mile, then a mile. Soon, gathering firewood became one of the most time-consuming and exhausting tasks of daily life. Detailed accounts from miners describe the hierarchy of wood. Green wood, freshly cut, was heavy and difficult to burn. It smoked terribly and produced little heat. Dry, seasoned wood was ideal, but it was rare. Most of what miners burned was somewhere in between, partially dry, full of sap, spitting and crackling dangerously. Pine was common and burned fast, hot and bright, but it consumed itself quickly. Oak was prized for its long burning coals, but oak was scarce in the high country. A quirky observation from the historical record. Some camps had wood thieves, men who would sneak around at night and steal split logs from other miners' piles. It sounds absurd, stealing firewood, but in the context of survival, it made perfect sense. Wood was life, and desperate men did desperate things. Camps without strong communal rules often descended into chaos, with everyone hoarding resources and trusting no one. You picture yourself now, earlier in the evening, standing around the central fire with a dozen other miners. The flames leap high, fed by a pile of pine branches someone dragged in from up the canyon. The heat is intense, almost painful on your face and hands, but your back is freezing. You keep turning, rotating slowly like meat on a spit, trying to warm every side of your body evenly. This was the ritual every evening. After the work of the day ended, miners would gather at the fire, not for socializing necessarily, but for survival. The fire was neutral ground. Claim disputes and personal grudges were set aside, at least temporarily, because everyone needed the warmth. You stood there until your body had absorbed as much heat as possible, and then you retreated to your tent, hoping the warmth would last.
Historians note that the campfire served important psychological functions beyond physical warmth. It was a focal point, a gathering place, a reminder that you weren't entirely alone in this brutal environment. Some camps developed traditions. Someone might tell a story, or sing a song, or read aloud from a newspaper that was months old. These moments of humanity were rare and precious. But here's the harsh reality. The warmth of the fire never lasted. Within minutes of leaving it, the cold reclaimed your body. Your face, which had felt flushed and hot, went numb. Your hands, which had tingled with returning circulation, stiffened again. The transition was brutal, almost cruel, because it reminded you that comfort was temporary and the cold was eternal. One miner from Tennessee wrote about the feeling of walking away from the fire. He compared it to leaving home, a sense of loss and longing that was almost physical. The fire represented everything he'd left behind: family, warmth, security, civilization. And every night he had to walk away from it and face the cold alone. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. You imagine yourself back at the fire now, savoring those last moments of warmth. The flames dance hypnotically, sparks spiral upward into the night sky, bright orange against the black. You hear the pop and hiss of sap boiling inside the logs. The smoke drifts unpredictably, sometimes engulfing you, making your eyes water and your throat burn. But you don't move. You endure the smoke because the warmth is worth it. Around you, other miners stand in similar poses, hands extended, faces blank, eyes distant. Nobody speaks. What is there to say? Everyone knows what the night holds. Everyone knows that in an hour they'll be shivering in their tents, wondering if they'll see morning. The fire is a temporary reprieve, nothing more.
Some miners, the ones who couldn't afford or didn't have tents, slept beside the fire. It was dangerous. Sparks could land on blanket and smolder, eventually bursting into flame. Men fell asleep and rolled too close, burning their clothes or hair. But for some, the risk was worth it. At least next to the fire, you had a chance of staying warm. In a tent, you were just slowly freezing. Historical records mention several deaths from campfire accidents. One man in Grass Valley fell asleep drunk and rolled into the embers. He died from his burns 3 days later, screaming in agony the entire time. Another miner's blanket caught fire while he slept. He survived, but with burns covering his legs and back. After that, the camp instituted a rule: no sleeping closer than 6 feet from the fire. But the rule was hard to enforce, especially when the temperature dropped below 0. As the fire burns lower, men begin to drift away. The wood supply is dwindling, and nobody wants to trek into the forest in the dark to gather more. The fire will die sometime in the night, and by morning only cold ashes will remain. Someone will have to rebuild it, coaxing life from embers or striking sparks from flint and steel. It's a never-ending cycle. Fire dies, fire is reborn, fire dies again. You take one last moment at the flames, absorbing every bit of heat you can. Your face feels tight and dry, almost sunburned. Your hands tingle. Your chest feels warm for the first time all day. And then you turn away, pulling your coat tight and trudge back toward your tent. The cold hits immediately, a physical force that steals your breath. But you keep walking, because what other choice do you have? Inside the tent, the darkness is absolute. You crawl to your spot, wrap yourself in your blanket, and lie down. The warmth from the fire fades within minutes, as you knew it would. And then there's only the cold, the relentless, crushing cold. You close your eyes and try to remember what the flames looked like. But the memory isn't enough. Nothing is ever enough.
You lie in the darkness, and gradually you become aware of the proximity of the other men. The tent is so small that everyone is nearly touching. The German immigrant is to your left, his breathing deep and raspy. The young man from Ohio is to your right, coughing intermittently. The older veteran is at the far end, silent as always. You can feel the heat radiating from their bodies, faint but real. Here's an uncomfortable truth that appears repeatedly in miners' journals. Men slept pressed against each other, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Sharing body heat was a survival strategy. In the coldest nights, it was the difference between life and death. Modesty and personal space were luxuries nobody could afford. Detailed accounts describe how miners would arrange themselves in rows, lying side by side like sardines. Sometimes they'd sleep in alternating directions, heads to feet, to maximize the distribution of warmth. The theory was that your head generated the most heat, so positioning it near someone else's feet would warm them. Whether this actually worked is debatable, but it gave people something to try, some sense of control. A quirky tidbit from the historical record: some camps had sleeping shifts, where men would rotate positions throughout the night. The warmest spots were in the middle of the group, where bodies were on both sides. The coldest spots were on the ends, where one side was exposed to the 10th wall. So, every few hours, everyone would shift, giving everyone a turn in the middle. It sounds absurd, but it reflected a kind of egalitarian survival ethic. You picture yourself now, lying rigidly still, trying not to touch the man next to you, but also trying to absorb whatever warmth he's giving off. It's an awkward dance. You want the heat, but you don't want the intimacy. This isn't friendship. This is desperation wearing the mask of cooperation.
Historians note that many miners struggled with the loss of privacy. Back home, they'd had their own beds, their own rooms, their own space. Here they were packed into tents with strangers, men whose languages they didn't speak, whose habits they found disgusting, freeze to death than a man sleeping in a communal tent. The shared warmth, the combined breath and body heat raised the interior temperature by a few crucial degrees. It wasn't comfortable, but it worked. One account from a miner in Auburn describes a night when the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the tent. He and his tent mates huddled together in a tight ball, arms wrapped around each other, breathing into a shared space to create a pocket of warm air. He wrote that he'd never felt so close to strangers and also so utterly alone. The physical closeness couldn't bridge the emotional distance. Everyone was trapped in their own private hell. You shift slightly, and your elbow brushes against the German's shoulder. He mutters something in his sleep, a fragment of a sentence you don't understand. The young man from Ohio coughs again, a wet, choking sound that makes you wonder how much longer he'll last. You've heard that cough before, in other camps, in other tents. It's the sound of lungs failing, of a body giving up. He probably won't survive the winter. The thought is cold and clinical, but it's also honest. Death was common in the camps. Men died from disease, from accidents, from exposure, from violence. The mortality rate was staggering. Some estimates suggest that 1 in 5 miners who came to California during the gold rush never left, at least not alive. And yet, new arrivals kept coming, driven by greed, hope, or desperation.
As you lie there, you begin to appreciate the grim calculus of survival. Every decision mattered: who you shared a tent with, how you arranged your blankets, whether you slept near the fire or sought shelter, when you ate, what you ate, how much water you drank. all of it fed into a complex equation where the prize for getting it right was simply waking up the next morning. The older veteran shifts position, and you hear the creak of his joints. He's been in the camps longer than anyone, or so the stories go. He's seen boom and bust, wealth and ruin, life and death. And yet he's still here, still scraping by, still clinging to the dream. You wonder what keeps him going. Is it stubbornness, madness, or does he simply have nowhere else to go? Historians often debate the psychological profile of long-term miners. Were they optimists, believing that the next pan would finally yield the big strike? Or were they fatalists, resigned to a life of hardship because any alternative seemed worse? The letters and diaries suggest a mix of both. Most men oscillated between hope and despair, sometimes within the same day. You close your eyes and try to sleep, but your mind won't settle. You think about the man lying beside you, strangers, united only by circumstance. Tomorrow you'll barely speak to them. You'll go to the creek, pan for gold, curse the cold and return exhausted. And then tomorrow night you'll lie here again, pressed against their bodies, sharing their warmth and feeling utterly alone. The intimacy is false, you realize. You're close enough to feel their heartbeats, but you don't know their names, their stories, their dreams. They're just bodies, sources of heat, tools for survival. And you're the same to them. It's a brutal, transactional relationship, stripped of everything that makes human connection meaningful. And yet you're grateful for them, because without them, you'd be dead. The math is simple. So you lie there, listening to their breathing, feeling their warmth, and accepting the strange, uncomfortable gift of their presence. It's not friendship, it's not comfort, but it's survival. And survival, you've learned, is all that matters.
Your stomach growls, a hollow, angry sound that cuts through the silence of the tent. You haven't eaten well in days, maybe weeks. The meals in camp are monotonous and barely sufficient. Beans, bacon, hardtack, coffee if you're lucky. Occasionally someone shoots a deer or catches fish from the creek, but those moments are rare. Mostly you survive on starches and salt, just enough to keep your body moving. Here's the thing about cold. It burns through your energy reserves at a terrifying rate. Your body works overtime to generate heat, consuming calories desperately. And when you're not eating enough, which most miners weren't, the cold becomes even more dangerous. You start to lose weight, your strength fades, your body begins to cannibalize itself, burning muscle and fat to stay warm. It's a death spiral. Detailed accounts from miners' journals describe the obsession with food. Men dreamed about meals from home. They wrote long, elaborate descriptions of dishes they'd eaten years ago. One miner from New York filled pages of his diary with recipes, detailing every ingredient, every step, as though writing them down could somehow make them real. It was a form of mental escape, a way to cope with the gnawing, constant hunger. The reality of food in the camps was grim. Prices were astronomical. A pound of flour might cost $1, a fortune when most miners were finding only a few dollars worth of gold per week, if any. Eggs were so expensive they became symbols of wealth. One story tells of a man who paid $5 for a single egg, cracked it open,
and discovered it was rotten. He ate it anyway, unable to bear the thought of wasting such a precious resource. A quirky tidbit from the historical record. Some miners tried to hunt or forage to supplement their diets, but most had no idea what they were doing. They'd shoot at birds and miss. They'd try to fish and catch nothing. They'd pick berries that made them violently ill. Survival skills that seemed instinctive were in fact learnt, and most miners never learnt them. They remained dependent on the overpriced goods sold by merchants.
You picture yourself now, earlier in the evening, eating your dinner. A plate of beans, cold and congealed, with a strip of bacon so hard you could barely chew it. A piece of hardtack, that dense, nearly indestructible biscuit that the army developed to feed soldiers. It tasted like cardboard, but it filled your stomach, barely. You washed it down with weak coffee, more water than beans, but at least it was hot. Historians note that the diet of gold rush miners was dangerously deficient. Scurvy was common, caused by a lack of vitamin C. Men's gums would swell and bleed, their teeth would fall out, old wounds would reopen. Some died from it, slowly and painfully. The cure was fresh fruit or vegetables, but those were nearly impossible to get in the high mountain camps, especially in winter. Another common ailment was dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation. The camps had no plumbing, no latrines beyond holes dug in the ground. Men relieved themselves wherever convenient, often near the creek that everyone used for drinking water. Disease spread quickly, and once it took hold in a camp, it could kill dozens before burning itself out. You lie there now, feeling the emptiness in your stomach. You know you should eat more, but there's no more to eat. Your rations are running low, and the next supply train won't arrive for weeks, maybe longer if the pass is snowed in. You're going to have to make what you have last, which means eating even less. The thought is depressing, but unavoidable. The relationship between hunger and cold is vicious. When you're cold, you need more food to generate heat, but when you're hungry, you have less energy to stay warm. The two feed on each other, creating a downward spiral that's difficult to escape. Many miners found themselves trapped in this cycle, growing weaker day by day, until finally they were too exhausted to work, too weak to care, and too cold to survive.
One account from a miner in Nevada City describes the moment he realized he was dying. He was lying in his tent, too weak to get up, too cold to sleep. His body had stopped shivering, which he knew was a bad sign. Shivering was your body's last defense. When it stopped, it meant your core temperature was dropping dangerously low. He wrote that he felt strangely peaceful, almost warm, which is a symptom of severe hypothermia. The brain starts to malfunction, creating false sensations of comfort. Fortunately, his tent mates noticed and forced him to move, to eat, to stay awake. He survived, but barely. You think about your own energy levels. You're exhausted, but is it the normal exhaustion of hard labor or something more dangerous? It's difficult to tell. Everything hurts. Your muscles ache. Your joints are stiff.
Your head pounds, but is that just life in the camps, or is it your body beginning to fail? The line between endurance and collapse is thinner than you'd like to admit. Historians often point out that the gold rush wasn't just a test of luck or skill in finding gold. It was a test of physical endurance. The men who succeeded, if you can call it that, weren't necessarily the best miners. They were the ones whose bodies could withstand the punishment. Youth helped. Prior experience with physical labor helped. But mostly it was luck. Some constitutions could handle the cold, the hunger, the illness. Others couldn't. As you lie there, you make a mental note to eat more tomorrow if possible. Maybe you can trade some tobacco for an extra portion of beans. Maybe you can stretch your rations a little further. Maybe you can survive another week, another month, another winter. The calculations never end. Every aspect of life becomes a math problem, where the answer determines whether you live or die. The German immigrant beside you shifts and mutters something. You wonder if he's hungry too. Probably everyone's always hungry. It's the baseline condition of camp life, a constant gnawing emptiness that never quite goes away. You learn to function with it, to ignore it, to push it to the back of your mind, but it's always there, waiting.
And so you close your eyes again, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in your gut, trying to conserve what little energy you have left. Sleep, when it finally comes, will be restless and unsatisfying. But it's better than lying awake, thinking about food you don't have and warmth you'll never feel. So you breathe slowly, steadily, and wait for unconsciousness to claim you. The young man from Ohio coughs again, and this time it's so violent that his whole body convulses. You hear him gasping for air, struggling, and then finally the coughing subsides into labored breathing. You know you should say something, ask if he's all right, but what would be the point? There's no doctor. There's no medicine. There's nothing anyone can do. Here's a brutal fact about the gold rush camps. Medical care was virtually non-existent. If you got sick or injured, you were on your own. Some camps had men who claimed to be doctors, but most were frauds or quacks with no real training. They'd sell you patent medicines, useless concoctions of alcohol and herbs, and charge you everything you had. Real doctors were rare, and their services were prohibitively expensive. Detailed accounts from the period describe injuries that would be minor inconveniences today, but were death sentences then. A cut that became infected. A sprained ankle that never healed properly, leading to gangrene. A broken bone set incorrectly, leaving a man crippled. Without antibiotics, without proper surgical tools, without even basic sanitation, the human body became fragile in ways that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. The most common ailments were respiratory infections, exactly what the young man beside you is suffering from. Pneumonia killed more miners than accidents or violence. The cold, damp conditions were perfect for lung infections. Men would develop a cough, ignore it because they couldn't afford to stop working, and then one day they'd be too weak to get out of bed. A week later, they'd be dead.
A quirky but horrifying detail from the records. Many camps had dead wagons, carts that would make rounds collecting bodies, In the winter months, the frozen ground made burial difficult, so corpses were sometimes stacked like cordwood, waiting for the spring thaw when graves could be dug. It was macabre but practical. Death was so common that it became routine, just another administrative task. You picture yourself now, imagining what would happen if you got seriously ill or injured. Who would take care of you? Your tent mates might help for a day or two out of basic human decency, but after that, they had their own survival to worry about. If you couldn't work, you couldn't earn. If you couldn't earn, you couldn't eat. And if you couldn't eat, you die. The equation was simple and merciless. Historians note that the isolation of the camps made everything worse. If you were in a city, even a rough frontier town, there might be a hospital or a charitable organization. But in the mountains, you were truly alone. The nearest settlement might be days away, over treacherous terrain. Even if someone was willing to carry you out, the journey itself might kill you. One account from a French miner describes watching a friend die from a simple infected cut on his hand. The infection spread up his arm, turning the flesh black and putrid. The smell was unbearable. They tried everything they could think of, washing it with whiskey, burning it with hot metal, even amputation, attempted with a saw and no anesthesia. Nothing worked. The man screamed for 3 days before finally falling silent. The writer described it as the worst experience of his life, worse than any battle, worse than any deprivation. You think about your own body, taking inventory of every ache and pain. Your fingers are cracked and bleeding from the cold water. Your back throbs from bending over the pan all day. Your feet are blistered inside your boots. None of it seems life-threatening yet, but you know how quickly things can turn. One small injury, one moment of bad luck, and you could be the next one dying in a tent, while your companions look away, helpless. The psychological impact of living with this constant threat is difficult to quantify. Many miners wrote about a kind of fatalism that set in. If you could die from something as simple as a cut or a cough, then what was the point of worrying? You either survived or you didn't. Caution could only take you so far. After that, it was just chance. Another common problem was frostbite. Men would lose feeling in their fingers or toes and not realize the damage until it was too late. The tissue would die, turn black, and eventually fall off. Some miners became known by their injuries. 3-Finger Jack, Stumpy Pete. These nicknames were crude but accurate. They'd lost parts of themselves to the cold, literal sacrifices to the dream of gold.
You flex your fingers inside your blanket, checking that they still move, still have feeling. They're stiff and painful, but they respond. That's good. That means you're still okay, for now. But you know tomorrow you'll be back in the creek, hands submerged in icy water for hours, and the damage will continue. It's cumulative. Every day takes a little more from you. The young man coughs again, softer this time, almost a whimper. You wonder if he has family somewhere, people who are waiting for him to come home rich and triumphant. Will they ever know what happened to him? Probably not. Men disappeared in these camps all the time. They died, or gave up and wandered off, or simply vanished into the wilderness. The lack of record-keeping meant that most deaths went unrecorded. You could cease to exist, and the world would never know. Historians estimate that thousands of miners died in the gold rush, but the exact number is unknown. There were no death certificates, no official counts. The camps were too chaotic, too transient. People came and went like ghosts. The only evidence of their existence was the occasional letter sent home, and even those stopped eventually. As you lie there in the darkness, listening to the labored breathing of the sick man beside you, you feel the weight of that anonymity. You could die here, in this freezing tent, and within a week your spot would be taken by someone else. Your name would be forgotten. Your story would be lost. It's a terrifying thought, but also strangely liberating. If nothing you do matters in the grand scheme, then maybe the only thing that matters is surviving one more night. And so you focus on that. One more night. One more breath. One more heartbeat. The young man coughs again, and you close your eyes, blocking out the sound, blocking out the fear, blocking out everything except the simple animal drive to stay alive.
The tent falls quiet for a moment, and in that silence you become aware of all the other sounds filtering through the canvas. The night in a mining camp is never truly silent. There's always something, some reminder that you're not alone in this vast, cold wilderness. First, there's the wind. It's constant. Sometimes a low moan, sometimes a sharp whistle, sometimes a howl that sounds almost alive. It batters the tents, making the canvas snap and ripple. You can hear it racing through the pines, a rushing sound like distant water. And periodically, it brings with it the crack of breaking branches, trees giving up under the weight of snow or ice. Then there are the human sounds. Somewhere across camp, a man is singing, his voice rough and off-key, slurred with drink. The song is something Irish, melancholy and slow. It drifts through the cold air, incongruous and haunting. You don't know who's singing or why, but the sound makes you feel both less alone and more lonely somehow. Detailed accounts from miners describe the acoustic landscape of the camps. The lack of ambient noise that we take for granted today, no cars, no electricity, no machinery, meant that every sound carried. You could hear conversations from 50 yards away. You could hear the clink of a bottle against a tin cup. You could hear a man weeping in his tent, trying to muffle the sound in his blanket. A quirky observation from the historical record: some miners complained more about noise than about cold. The snoring, the coughing, the muttering in sleep, the arguments that erupted at all hours, it all echoed through the thin canvas walls. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford, auditory or otherwise. Your life became public property. Every sound you made heard and judged by your neighbors. You picture yourself now, lying perfectly still, trying not to add to the cacophony. Your stomach gurgles embarrassingly.
The German immigrant beside you lets out a long, sonorous snore. The old veteran shifts position, and you hear the rustle of his clothes, the creak of his joints. Every tiny sound is amplified in the darkness.
Outside, you hear the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Someone walking past, probably heading to relieve themselves. The footsteps fade, and then there's a splash of liquid, the sound unnervingly clear in the cold air. Then the footsteps return, shuffling and unsteady. Whoever it was probably had too much to drink. That was common. Men drank to ward off the cold, to dull the pain, to forget where they were and why. Historians note that alcoholism was rampant in the camps. Whiskey was expensive, but always available. Some men drank themselves to death, literally. They'd start drinking in the evening to get warm, and by morning they'd be found frozen in a snowbank, too drunk to make it back to their tent. It happened regularly enough that it barely merited comment in the journals. Another sound cuts through the night, dogs barking. Some miners kept dogs, though what they fed them is a mystery. The animals were scavengers, competing with the miners for scraps. But they provided companionship, and occasionally they'd alert the camp to danger. A bear wandering too close, or strangers approaching. The barking goes on for a minute, frantic and sharp, and then stops abruptly. Whatever triggered it has passed. You hear the creak, too, even from here. Its constant burble and rush, never stopping, never slowing. In daylight, it's where you work, where you search for gold. At night, it's just another sound, a reminder of the endless flow of time and water, both indifferent to your suffering. The creek will still be there long after you're gone, long after the camp is abandoned and forgotten. One of the most unsettling sounds is the silence itself. There are moments, usually deep in the night, when everything stops. The wind dies, the snoring pauses, even the creek seems to quiet. In those moments, the silence is so complete it feels oppressive, like a physical weight pressing down on you. You strain your ears, listening for anything, desperate for proof that the world still exists beyond the canvas walls. Historians have written about the psychological impact of these soundscapes. The constant noise prevented rest, but the sudden silences were even worse. They triggered anxiety, a primal fear of being alone in the dark. Some men reported feeling like they were the last person alive, that everyone else had died or disappeared, leaving them trapped in a frozen hell.
You hear a coyote howling somewhere in the distance. A long, wavering cry that rises and falls. Then another answers, and another, until it sounds like a choir of ghosts. The sound makes your skin prickle. Coyotes aren't dangerous to humans usually, but there's something unsettling about their voices. Something that speaks to a deeper, older fear. The young man coughs again, breaking the spell. You're reminded that you're not alone, for better or worse. You're surrounded by other struggling, suffering humans, all of you trying to survive the night. The sounds of their existence, their breathing, their movements, their bodily functions are both comforting and intrusive. As the night wears on, you begin to catalogue the sounds unconsciously. The snap of canvas, the whistle of wind, the crunch of snow under unknown feet, the distant crack of ice forming on the creek. Each sound tells a story, paints a picture of life in the camp, and slowly, gradually, the sounds begin to blur together, becoming a kind of lullaby, harsh and discordant, but familiar. You feel yourself drifting, not quite asleep, but not fully awake either. The sounds continue, but they recede, becoming background noise. Your body is exhausted, your mind is numb, and finally, mercifully, you begin to slip toward something resembling rest. The night is long, but it won't last forever. Morning will come, eventually. It always does.